Hi, my name's Justin Schaub, and I'm the founder and run our engineering team here at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. It's been about 4 months since my last video, so it's actually been before we were at MMS Mall of America edition, just because we've been doing a lot of feature updates here at PatchMyPC and just been super busy. But with that said, I am excited to get back into the Config Manager video series that we're doing and talking about CMPivot in this one, probably my favorite feature now within SCCM. Now, if you didn't make MMS Mall of America, I will talk about a giveaway that we are doing. So you have until August 28th to enter this first raffle if you want to enter for a chance to win a MMS Jazz Edition ticket that includes the hotel and airfare for that. So this is one of 2 giveaways. So if you don't make this one by August 28th, we will be doing a second one probably in the next week or 2. Even if you don't win the raffle, if you have any way that you can justify going to an event, I do think this is by far the best Config Manager event in my opinion. That even includes some of the Microsoft events that we had back when I was at PFE. I think this is the most community focused, as well as you probably get the most access to the Config Manager product group at this event. So just want to let you know, you're probably an SCCM admin, so definitely wouldn't hurt to enter. I think this is a great event, and you'll probably get a lot of value from it if you are able to go. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into our demo, talking about CMPivot. So I hope to do a deep dive into CMPivot, kind of show you what it is, what it can do, and just go through the workflow of how CMPivot works on the client and server side. So first thing, we're just going to look at an overview of the docs and just kind of get a overview of what it actually is, right? So when I think about CMPivot, I kind of compare it to hardware inventory, except it's real time. So for example, kind of the first thing that they mention here is your site collects hardware inventory on a weekly basis by default. So if you were to go into a device, right click it, click Start, and then Resource Explorer, this is going to be the hardware inventory collected from that device if you expand the hardware tab. So for example, you can see things like the installed products, right? So what's existing in add and remove programs. This is all data that comes in through hardware inventory. There's just a massive number of data collected through the hardware inventory cycle. So things like network adapters, memory, operating system, essentially a lot of the things that you would be querying within the database are probably coming from hardware inventory. So when we start thinking about CMPivot, what we're really talking about is a way that you can real-time query a lot of this data that you would see in hardware inventory, as well as additional attributes that we'll be reviewing. So essentially, it's kind of like a real-time version of hardware inventory that you can use to query the device. Now, this came out in Config Manager 1806, so it's been out about a year, and there's been a lot of improvements in the 3 current branch updates since it came out. So just scrolling through the docs, first thing that we'll kind of mention is what it looks like. I'm not going to dig too deep into this dialog just because we'll be reviewing that within the console. But as far as the query language goes, it does use a query language called Kusto. So it's part of Azure initially is kind of where this came from. And I'll just show you some of the syntax that I think might be helpful prior to us going into a demo. So let me just see if I can find the different operators that are documented here. So this is what I'm looking for. So kind of when you're querying different attributes of data within the CMPivot tool, these are a lot of the operators that you'd be using within that query language. I'll also include the doc to this page as well as the doc to the Kusto query language that CMPivot is actually using. So it is a read-only query language, but within CMPivot, you can take actions based on the data that you find from those queries. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into this. So the way that CMPivot would work is in 1906, you could simply go in and right-click a collection to start it. Now, one new feature with 1906 of Config Manager is it's also available in a standalone tool that you don't have to launch directly from the Config Manager console. So you can essentially enable a pre-release feature in 1906 that would allow you to start CMPivot as its own application, and then you could simply browse to the collection you want to query directly in the standalone tool. But in our case, we're just going to go ahead and launch it from the console, right-click our all desktop and server clients, and then choose Start CMPivot. So in my case, since I'm running that against all desktop and servers, any query that we initiate within CMPivot would be running against all devices. Obviously, if you have a large environment, you may want to consider what collections you might want to query based on the data that you need to get real time. All right, so first thing we have when we launch this is our home. There's actually some really good docs, so you may want to just kind of go through the quick welcome, see some examples, but probably what you'll be working with a lot are going to be the entities on the left side. So these are essentially kind of the different objects that you can query on within CMPivot. Now, once you determine what you want, you just jump over to the Query tab, and this is where you can actually start querying different things within your environment. Now, they do have IntelliSense enabled by default, so this can be quite helpful because as you type things in, it can kind of complete different statements within the Kusto language that you would be using within CMPivot. So, for example, let's just get super simple, and let's say that you want to query installed software. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to insert. Oh, I think I clicked that twice. Let me just clear that out. You could either double click or choose to insert. And that would essentially say, I want to query installed software on all devices in the all desktop and server collection. So there is no filter on this. So it would essentially return every single program that is installed within these. So I'll go ahead and run this. Now, obviously, if you're in a production environment, especially when we're not using any type of filters, this could return a massive amount of data depending on how many clients that you have. Now, in our case, it's only 12, so this probably won't take more than a couple seconds. We can see that we're already getting data in here, returning different applications that are installed on our devices. So there we go. Looks like the query completed. And we had 10 of 12 machines kind of online and return data back for us. So from here, you can see that we have just a lot of different data on all these different devices showing the installed software. This essentially is corresponding to if you were to using hardware inventory. This is very similar to the way that the installed applications would report back. The only difference here is this is obviously real time, right? So it's essentially kind of, this is the static version reported from hardware inventory. By default, it's collected every 7 days, whereas within CMPivot, this is all happening real time, returning what's currently installed on that device. All right, so let's say we wanted to add a couple filters in here. So if we use the pipe character, we can now see that we have the IntelliSense kind of showing us what we might want to do next. So let's say we want to find installed software, and then we want to add a where filter. So we're going to say where, and then we can see that we have the different values within this showing up as what we can use for our where. So for example, the different things we see here on the left, we are getting auto-populated here. So let's say you don't want to return everything, right? So you want to look where the product name, so this is essentially the display name in add and remove programs. And let's say we want to find where it equals Google Chrome. So if we look on a device that actually has Chrome installed, what's nice about Chrome is that they do use the same display name within all versions of Chrome. So for example, they don't include the version number within the actual name. So we could simply use a equals filter, so it's exactly like Google Chrome. So jumping back over here, let's go ahead and choose query. So now we can see that of the all products that we previously queried, we quickly got a filter when we said, let's only find Chrome, right? So we can see the devices that have Chrome installed instead of just everything. All right, now let's take it one step further, and let's say we want to find where Google Chrome is installed and the version is less than 76.0.3809.100. So this is the current version of the latest product. So we can see it looks like we have about 2 devices installed. So let's say we essentially want to find outdated versions. So we can add and product version, right? So product version less than, and then I can paste that value in. So this will essentially be looking for Google Chrome, and the product version must be less than the latest version that we're currently querying. So let's go ahead and run that. And now we can see of those installed software, we took that filter one step lower. So now we can see that we have, it looks like 6 devices that essentially have an outdated version of Chrome. Now let's say that we wanted to filter this into a pie chart by the version number. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy a query just to save some time here. So now what we're doing is saying installed product, where it's Google Chrome, summarized by the count of product versions. So that's going to be what we filter on, and then we're going to use a pie chart. So within CMPivot, if we look back at the docs, There's a lot of different operators that we can use for different charts. So there's a column chart. In our case, we're going to be using this pie chart example for showing the different versions installed. So let's jump back over to CMPivot and then choose query. So now within that, we can see that we now have a pie chart saying we have 2 versions of 76.0, basically that latest one. And then we have 6 different devices with an older version. Now, obviously, if you had a lot of different versions in here, you would have a much larger pie chart with different splits in it, for example. All right, let's say that we wanted to change that to a column chart. Go ahead and run query. And now we can see it in a column chart where we can see the different versions here. All right, so let's clear that up. And let's say that we wanted to now use the administrators entity. So let's go ahead and choose to add the administrators. And let's say we wanted to find it where principal source equals local. So this is going to find local administrators on the device. So let's run this query and see what we get back. All right, so now we returned against all our devices, essentially members of the local administrator group coming from the local group. So pretty cool. So you could kind of find whether there's like any unexpected admins here. So here's just an example of an account that I made a local admin that shouldn't be. So you can kind of find, who is local administrators and are there any account names that don't match with what you expect to be there. So you could have different additional and filters where maybe you're finding where it's not like the accounts that should be there, for example. So quite helpful if you ever wanted to kind of find that. Now, let's say you want to find all 32-bit operating systems. So I'm just going to paste this query in just to save some time. So we're essentially running the OS option here where the architecture is 32-bit. So this would just be corresponding to the OS entity. So if we come back over here, OS, we can see that there's a field in here for architecture, right? So if we wanted to find all 32-bit devices, we can go ahead and run that query. And we can see that we have 3 operating systems that are 32-bit. Now let's see if we can figure out how we could add this to a pie chart. So let's do summarize. All right, let's actually take this off. I think we want OS, and we want to of the OS architecture by OS architecture. So let's try this. Summarize count by. All right, let's see if that, there we go. So we're essentially getting the OS entity, and then we're summarizing the installed counts for the OS architecture. And then we're splitting that into a pie graph, similar to what we did with Chrome. So that's kind of how you could return the OS architectures, for example. Another pretty cool one, let's say you wanted to find a running process. So in this case, we're just querying a process for our publishing service to see if it's running. So let's say you had a process that you were trying to search out for real time to see if it's running on any devices, whether that could be like trying to find like a malware process or just maybe something more internal to find if something is running. So we can see that we have 2 servers that are running that process, for example. Another pretty cool one, so there's a SMB config entity that we can use. So right over here, we can see that there's a built-in one for SMB ports. So let's say that, for example, with WannaCry, that was being exploited over SMB protocol 1. With CMPivot, you could essentially run a query real-time against all devices within your environment and see if SMB1 is enabled. So think about if you had that capability back when this exploit was happening, and you could go out and real-time query what devices had SMB protocol 1 enabled, and then you could essentially take action on them by using a script to essentially turn that off. So that could be a way that, let's say there was some kind of exploit, and you could use some type of query to determine whether the protocol or whatever was causing that was essentially enabled. So this would be a pretty cool example of how you could have potentially handled that if CMPivot was out at that time. So pretty cool option here. Another pretty interesting one is the AutoStartSoftware. So this could essentially find what programs are set up to auto run on your devices. So I'm going to go ahead and run a query, and what we're essentially going to be querying here is where the startup of any item is from a current user. So this would essentially be elements within the current user run registry values to to essentially see if there's any users that have been adding things in startup. Sometimes this could be like malware is a common place they would add auto start applications within the current user's auto start key, for example. So that's pretty cool. Now let's see if we wanted to filter this down to a specific auto start process. Let me go ahead and update that and then run the query. So this would find any auto start application where it's zoomit.exe. So just the zoom in tool that we're looking at that you see me zooming in with, where that's a auto start process on any devices. So pretty cool example here of how you can filter that for specific processes to find devices that have that in their auto startup. All right, cool. So that's a lot of different queries, kind of some examples. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of good resources on the docs, and you can essentially find a lot of the different values you can query directly here on the left side. So I think that should be enough to kind of get some of the basics about how you can query different attributes within CMPivot. Now, what can really be cool is when you start taking action on different return queries that you get. So for example, just a quick overview of some things that we have going on here. I do have a couple of scripts that I pre-created. The ones that we'll probably be looking at today is a script that will disable the self-update feature of Java, and then one that will set the Google Chrome homepage. Now, what we're going to do is use CMPivot to find different data that we want to take action on. So in this example, we're going to be using the registry query. Let me just go ahead and pre-fill in this. And I'll include all of these queries in an example file that we have within the accompanying blog post. So for example, within this CMPivot query, we're essentially querying the HKey local machine, software JavaSoft, JavaUpdate policy registry key. And then we're finding the EnableJavaUpdate registry data, and then we're finding where the value is equal to 1. So essentially we're finding where the registry value for EnableJavaUpdate is set to 1 for the value. So quick jump over to one of our devices. This is our Windows 10 x64 machine, and we can see that within that registry key, the EnableJavaUpdate value is set to 1. So that means Java updates are currently enabled, and this would be the default attribute unless you specifically disable that in your deployment. So let's say that you got a complaint that users were getting notified about Java updates, and you wanted to turn that off globally so that you could control that within Config Manager. So I'm going to go ahead and run this query against all my devices. There we go, and we can now see that we have one device showing that the EnableJavaUpdate value is 1, right? So if we go back, that's that machine that we were just remoted into. Now let's say that you wanted to take action against this. So you could either create a collection and run a script to that collection, or if you only want to do it at individual devices, we could right-click that device and choose to run script. So we're going to run the DisableJavaUpdate PowerShell script that I pre-created within this environment. So I'll go ahead and choose next and then run. Now on the client side, when we ran the script, we can see that it reported a exit code of 0. So that means that it was essentially updated. So if I go ahead and refresh this reg value, we can see that real time, we changed that value from 1 to 0. And then we also set a few different attributes to turn off updates and notifications for Java as well. So looking back into our config-man console, if we go to our scripts and we look at disable Java updates, we can essentially see that it's just pretty basic, just a PowerShell script setting some different reg values to turn off that update policy. So pretty cool example. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at, and for this, we're going to dig a little bit deeper in, and we're going to show you how CMPivot performs the query from the server to the client, and to also show how the remediation scripts happen in real time. So this one should be pretty cool. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to query one other value. So we're going to change our registry key. We're going to be looking at the software policy Google Chrome registry key, and then we're going to find any devices that have a homepage location registry key and where the value is not patchmypc.com. So essentially, if we go back to the client side, this one should, I believe, have this. So if we look at software policies, Chrome, and then homepage. So on this machine, I've set the home page for all users to google.com. So what should happen is when this query runs against this device, it should detect that it's not patchmypc.com. So we would essentially be finding any devices where that is not the value that we can take action on. So kind of jumping into the process of what happens when you run this query, we're going to dig into what actually gets performed on the server side and client side. So essentially, when you perform a query using CMPivot, what happens is the site server is going to initiate a notification through the fast channel. So this is called BGB. This has been around since Config Manager 2012 Service Pack 1 when endpoint protection became real time. So essentially, everything before Service Pack 1 was very slow for when actions would take place. But once Config Manager started integrating System Center endpoint protection, they added in the BGB channel, which is essentially things that you can take action against clients real time. So that's what CMPivot is essentially tying into, is the BGB channel. So what happens when you right-click, open a collection with CMPivot, and perform a query, it notifies the BGB server that there's an action that should take place immediately on the client side. So that's kind of the first thing that we're going to see happen, is that's going to take place. On the client side, we're going to see the notification for that action come into the CCM notification agent log. You can see information about that. And then the script will actually be what runs the check against the client. So in the script.log, we'll see that taking place. The client will then send the status back using state messages. So right after the script executes and it returns the value that you're querying, that will go back up to the state message channel, and then the server will process that using the state sys component. So it's similar to software updates, with the exception that this is going to happen real time using the fast channel or BGB channel. When we go ahead and run this query, I'll kind of show you what this is going to look like for the processing. So if we go to our site server logs and we open up the BGB log, here we go. So what's going to happen is when I come back into CMPivot and when we query this new Google Chrome homepage where it's not patchmypc.com, right when I click query here, we're going to see there we go. So we're going to see the BGB server kick in here in a second. There we go. So we can see that it just sent a push out to the clients in the BGB channel. Now, if you don't have verbose logging enabled, you may not see this take place within this log file. So just keep that in mind. Within the docs, it does mention you will need verbose logging for some of these logs to show what I'm showing you here. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So on the client side, if we go ahead and jump over to one of our clients that were in the all device collection, if we go ahead and look at the CCM logs folder, we can look at the CCM notification log. So CCM notification agent.log. So here's where we can see that a couple seconds ago, once that BGB server-side component reached out to this client real time, you can see that it now has the different actions that it needed to take place. So once it got the real-time policy for that query that we ran in CMPivot, which is essentially this regValue check, what then happened back on the client side, if we look at the scripts.log, it executed a PowerShell script to check that reg value. So we can actually see in the scripts log when verbose logging is enabled on the client side, we can see it essentially running the script to check the registry values. And there's like some encryption here, so it may not make a lot of sense from the actual log command line within PowerShell. But essentially what happened is there was a temporary script that's run that gets stored under the script store folder. And this is essentially the script that got called with some different parameters to our device that was querying that reg value real time. And once that query took place running that PowerShell script, it would save the output and then it would send that to our server using state messages. So if we look at the state message.log on our client, once that script ran, it would forward that up to the management point. And then on the site server side of things, the statesys.log or statemanager.log, or I'm sorry, the statesys is actually what we wanted. This will show the real-time state messages get processed into the database. So there might have been some things that happened around the same time around software update summarization, but you can see the real-time queries getting inputted back into the database when that happens. And back on the site, you can kind of see what that would look like on the server side within the state sys.log. So you see something like this line here if you have debug logging enabled, where you actually see it input the results into the database. So that's going to be essentially what comes back to CMPivot. And we can, of course, see that this device here, the home page is not patch my PC. Therefore, we got Google return back, which is the current home page. Now, let's go ahead and run a script. And let's say that we wanted to change that home page. Before we do that, let's jump back over to our device. And if we go ahead and open Google Chrome, we can see that Google is in fact the home page, right? So if we come into settings, we can see that google.com is set as the home page.
I found these. The first result is from Google.
Oh, looks like Google is kicking in for me too. Sorry about that. So what happens here is this value should be changed using the script that we're about to run against this device. So coming back into SCCM, I'm going to go ahead and run that script against this individual device, and let's go ahead and run that. There we go. So we can see we got a good exit code. So if we come back to that client, so what's kind of interesting about this is if we go back to the scripts log, we can see that the actual query from CMPivot was executed through PowerShell. And of course, our script, since it was a PowerShell script, also got executed using the scripts log. So if we go ahead and look here, we can see that in the script store, come back here, there we go. And let's just take a look. This one started with D96. So if we come back here, and then depending on the permissions, you may not be able to see this by default, but if we look at that D96 script and edit that in Notepad++, we can see this is essentially the script that we have coming from SCCM that's going to be setting the homepage value using PowerShell. And I'll include this within the blog post that you can download if you wanted to use this as an example. So if we come back to our registry and go ahead and refresh that, we can see that it set the home page now to patchmypc.com. So if we go ahead and look at that, we can refresh Chrome, and we now have that home page configured. So essentially, we use CMPivot to query where the reg value does not equal a specific value that we want, and then we use the script feature real time to remediate that. So if we were to come back in here, and let's say that we wanted to find where it does equal patch my PC. So I just changed that from a not equals to a equals. So go ahead and query that. And we can now see that we have about 6 devices that are returning that homepage value within here. So that looks good. Now, let's say that we wanted to run a script against the all desktop and servers collection. So I'm going to go ahead and run script. We're going to run the homepage script, and we're just going to run that against all 12 devices. So let me go ahead and come back to CMPivot, copy my query, and close that out. Okay. So we'll wait for this script to set the home page on those 6 devices, and then we'll come back in and run a query. So it looks like it actually completed on 11. So we'll go ahead and come back here, and let's see if we can query that. So I think this might be using my cache results. Let me just go ahead and right click, start CMPivot once more, and then run that query again. And let's see if we get more than 6 devices now that we're refreshing our query, and it's not using the initial cache query when we only had the 6 devices that had that value set. And there we go. So now we can see that we have 11 devices that have the home page configured to patchmypc.com. So if I were to open Google Chrome on any of these devices, let's say we want to open it back on this main server. Let's go ahead and close that out. Open that up here. We can now see that we configured the home page for essentially all devices within my lab to have the same home page using CMPivot with the conjunction of the scripts feature to do that real time. All right, and then let's run one more query and take some action on it. So if we go ahead and look at the query that we're running now, it's pretty straightforward. So we're doing the installed software where the product name is like Java 8, and the publisher is Oracle Corporation. So if we jump back over to our Win 10 device, we can see that we have a couple different Java runtimes as well as Java SDKs installed. So we have the 32 and 64-bit version of JRE on this device, as well as the development kit. So let's jump back into SCCM, and we can now see that we are getting some results back from our clients. So for our Windows 10 machine, as you expect, we've returned back those instances of Java runtime. Now, let's say that within SCCM, I'll include these scripts for an example. We have two different PowerShell scripts that remove the Java runtime 64-bit or the Java runtime 32-bit version of them. So I'll include that in the resources in the blog post or YouTube video if you wanted to use this as an example. So essentially, let's say that we want to uninstall the 32-bit version of Java 8. So what we would want to do is if we wanted to do that on Windows 10, but only get this 32-bit version, we would want to exclude the 64-bit one. And what's cool about this is that it does include some additional text within the product name. So what we can do is we can say where the product name is like Java 8, wildcard, and product name is not like, so if we do exclamatory contains, that's a not contained statement. And then we could do 64-bit like that, and then end the query. So what that's going to essentially do when we query this is it should exclude this value here because it has 64-bit in the title for the product name. So let's go ahead and query. And now we can see that we're getting data back. So on that Windows 10 64-bit device, there we go, we can now see that we're returning only the 32-bit version of Java because we excluded 64-bit from that query. So let's say that we want to right-click this device and run a script against it. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Run Script. I'm going to choose my PowerShell script that I've added that removes only the 32-bit version of Java 8 runtime. So I'll go ahead and choose Next here, and then Next here. So jumping over to the client side, if we look at the scripts log, there we go. We should see any second now, there we go. So script just kicked in. We can see it's attempting to download the script. And now it's executing our uninstall script that should now live in this folder. So if we go ahead and choose to view that script, we can see this is the uninstall script for Java 8 32-bit that we provided within our console. So that's probably currently running. It does take probably a couple minutes here. Let me just see. I think that we do create a log in the Windows temp. Let me see if I can find that. There we go. So if I go ahead and open that, you can essentially see that we have a log that also shows what was uninstalled. So we can see that we ran the MSI uninstall command for Java 8 update 221, just the 32-bit version. So if I go ahead and refresh now, we can see that that was automatically uninstalled. So just an example of kind of how you can use that as well as take action for like uninstalling products using CMPivot in scripts. I hope this video was helpful and thank you for watching.